much, Charlie, for the gracious introduction, and thank you for all of you for arranging my visit here. Really been looking forward to this. France plays a very important role in this story because France and Britain were the two major powers that the South depended on for recognition, intervention, independence. And the contest was not just in the marbled courts of power, but also in the streets, in the newspapers, and in the public mind. I began my book, and I'll begin my talk tonight with a little anecdote that takes place in March of 1861, before the Civil War had even begun, and an unnamed American diplomat has joined the diplomatic corps at the Tuileries Palace for a concert that evening, and one, again unnamed, high official in Napoleon III's court snidely remarks, "So it seems your republic is falling apart." And the diplomat, you're not supposed to talk like that with diplomats, but he was flustered and said, "Oh no, I hope not yet." And he said, "It will. All republics are doomed to fall apart sooner or later, and yours has lasted long enough." There was a cynicism about the idea, the whole idea of government by the people. It seemed they kept referring to it as the Republican experiment. Popular government was an experiment, it was fragile, it was naturally inclined to descend into anarchy or despotism. And for Europeans, it seemed like the experiment had failed. Ever since 1789, when revolution erupted here in Paris, Europe had been convulsed by revolutionary movements, all of which had either failed, some would say, or were crushed by the power of the old regime. And by 1860, the only republic of any size was Switzerland, along with a few small city-states like San Marino, which plays a cameo role in my story. Francois Guizot, the former foreign minister with in the July monarchy, famously said that not to be a Republican at 20 is proof of the want of a heart. To be one at 30 is proof of the want of a head. You've seen that in various iterations, but it begins with Guizot. Napoleon III, Emperor Napoleon III, had been elected as president of the Second Republic, you may recall, at the end of 1848. And of course he had a recognizable name, and he was the nephew of Napoleon I. He was elected by a huge landslide, and before the next election decided that he would turn the Republic, the Second Republic, into an empire, and crowned himself Emperor Napoleon III. A familiar story, those of you who are familiar with his uncle's rise to power. For Napoleon III, he saw the American crisis as an opportunity to reclaim lost empires in the Americas. For a long time, he had been brooding about a plan to take control of Central America and Mexico, to build a canal through Mexico, or Nicaragua was his original design. This is later realized, of course, in the Panama Canal, but Napoleon III was one of the first to put this together in a geopolitical plan, which came to be known as the Grand Design. It was linked also to an idea of regeneration, of resurgence, of what was referred to as the Latin race. The whole idea of a Latin America is invented within this rhetoric, this discourse about French leadership of the Latin race. And it has the nice effect of kind of blurring the distinctions between Hispanic peoples, that is of Spanish descent, or of Portuguese descent, or and the French. And of course the French now were to be the leaders of the Latin race in the Old World and the New, and would challenge the Teutonic Anglo-Saxons. In Latin America in particular, the feeling was that Anglo-Saxon republicanism had corrupted and weakened the Latin American people. And so Napoleon was going to create in Mexico a showcase of monarchical order, of Catholic authority, and all of the Spanish-American republics, which were convulsed by coups d'etats and military despotism, they would join under this French hegemony. And he even arranged for the brother of Maximilian, the Austrian Habsburg. Never mind why you appoint a Habsburg archduke to lead the Latin race. It was Catholic. This is politics. And only in the mind of Napoleon III could this be seen as a viable scheme. It also brought in Charlotte, Carlota, who was, of course, the daughter of Leopold, King of the Belgians. And so there was a big, deep game here in Mexico. Mexico, in order to survive, in order to get on its feet, required the U.S. war to continue and to distract the United States, but also to create a buffer state between the United States Republic and this Latin Catholic empire that was expanding in Mexico. The hope was that they would take back the Mexican cession that had been lost to the United States in 1848. There was talk of bringing Texas back into Mexico as well. And Louisiana. This had been sold to the United States. Now Louisiana had seceded from the United States. It was ours to take. Louis Napoleon or his minions were floating rumors to that effect. Now, the Confederate strategy in Europe was pretty clear. What they wanted, they had an army, they had a flag. You've heard a lot about our flag of late. They had a new constitution and a government of their own. They needed to be recognized. It's like all aspiring nations. You need to be recognized by the family of nations, as it was called then and now. And they needed international recognition. This was more than just a courtesy. It meant that you existed. It meant that you could make treaties, commercial treaties, military alliances. You could borrow money. You were a creature, a national actor in the law, under the law of nations, international law. They sent over diplomats, envoys to France. They sent John Slidell, a Louisiana politician, actually from New York. He had come down, he married a very wealthy French Creole woman in Louisiana, and he and his beautiful daughters, who became the toast of Parisian society, came over, and he and his family entered into the social circles of the court. He went to the racetrack, he enjoyed evenings at the casino, he was pretty good in French, and everyone was talking about his daughters. One of the daughters married Baron Erlanger, who was a wealthy financier who got the Pope to annul his first wife, the marriage with his first wife, and it was quite an event. The House of Erlanger was also loaning money to the Confederacy. So there are lots of strategies involved here. They also sent over what we would call a propagandist, but of course they didn't use that term. They disowned any affinity for propaganda, but a man by the name of Edwin de Leon. De Leon is the way it's pronounced in South Carolina. It's a Spanish name. He was from a Sephardic Jewish family, come to, with his family to Columbia, South Carolina, where we live now, and was a newspaper journalist and a diplomat. He had been a consul in Alexandria, Egypt, and a very skilled and very smart, persuasive man. He wrote a pamphlet in French, not very good French according to all accounts, translated as The Truth about the Confederate States of America, in which we learned that slavery, unlike that practiced by the French in Haiti and the British in the West Indies was a benign domestic institution, that the slaves were happy, and that their only concern during this war was that the dreaded Yankees were going to come down and take them away from their masters. The U.S. strategy was, of course, to do everything possible to stop recognition from happening. That, first of all, it was a really tough hard power message. William Seward, the Secretary of State, who often doesn't get as much credit as Lincoln does for statesmanship, used to invite journalists in and diplomats and light a cigar, let the match burn for a while, puff the smoke into the air, and say, if any nation dares to interfere in this domestic insurrection, we will wrap the world in flames. This will be a war of the continents. This will be a war of the worlds. I was going to call my book War of the Worlds. H.G. Wells beat me to it. But one of the other things they did was to create a kind of soft power appeal. That is, soft power we use today, they didn't use it, nor did they talk about public diplomacy. But I believe that public diplomacy and soft power were really invented in the American Civil War. This is a war that is being fought on the public stage with mass circulation newspapers and journals, and there is a new concept of something called the public mind. And even in non-democratic societies, or governments like that of France under the Second Empire, governments were afraid of the public. They needed to mind what public opinion said. Lord Palmerston in Britain said, someone asked him, what is public opinion compared to armies? He said, public opinion is stronger than armies. Now we have to be careful of it. I'm going to tell some stories about France and about how this soft power public diplomacy played out here. It didn't look like the Union was very well positioned at first. They had this very crafty adversary, John Slidell, from Louisiana, as the Confederate envoy. And Paris at this time was filled with Confederate sympathizers. A lot of Louisianans who came over, they felt more comfortable here in Paris than in London, where there was all this anti-slavery sentiment, all these abolitionists. And they enjoyed the French life and the language, and there was quite a presence among the Confederate elite in Paris. The Union sent over a political hack from New Jersey as the U.S. minister by the name of William Dayton. He had been on the Republican ticket back in '56. Lincoln felt that he owed New Jersey a favor, and Dayton helped deliver it for the Republican Party, and there you go. Now, it seems crazy that you'd send someone over who had no knowledge of Europe, France, never been to Europe, and couldn't speak, and wouldn't learn a word of French. But there he was, and in fact, that was very common in the Foreign Service at that time. John Bigelow once said that if diplomats speak abroad as they do at home, the fewer languages they have at their command, the better. Now that introduces my next character. This is John Bigelow, who was the consul general to Paris. It's supposed to be a lower diplomatic post that takes care of business affairs rather than foreign policy. John Bigelow was a New Yorker. He was well-traveled. He was an intellectual and a scholar, really a man of parts, and he had just made a ton of money selling the Evening Post. He was in partnership with William Cullen Bryant, and was about ready to retire when the war broke out. And Seward asked him to go over to France. To his credit, William Dayton said, I need some help over here. I need someone who can deal with the press and someone who understands these people and can deal with them. And Bigelow came over. He was he just loved the French language. He was doing a biography of a French philosophe. he just loved all things French, and all the way over on the boat he was studying his French, and like a schoolboy he would report in his diary how he did in conversation that day. He jumped into French culture, he attended lectures, he read all the journals, and he really was a master of this new art of public diplomacy. One of his key ideas, and one of I think the keys to the success of the Union, was that whereas the Confederacy wanted to control the message, they let Edmond de Leon write his own pamphlets. They hired another, Henry Holtz, a Swiss newspaperman, also with diplomatic experience, to publish The Index, a journal in London that was the voice of the Confederacy. What Bigelow decided to do early on was to let native authors raise their pens for the Union. Okay, sometimes for a price. A man named Malespine was glad. He was a sincere Republican. He really believed in the Union cause, but he wanted a little money, and then came back and asked for more. But he did good work writing for the National. But my favorite employee, enlistee in the Union cause was a history professor by the name of Edouard Laboulaye. Some of you may not have heard of him, but he's a very important figure for reasons that you'll recognize soon enough. Laboulaye taught law and history at the Collège de France. He had been intimidated under Napoleon III's regime. His colleague, Jules Michelet, the famous historian, had been fired because he had issued some pro-Republican sentiments. And Laboulaye, who was the leading expert on American constitutional law and a real advocate of the American system of government, decided to switch topics during the 1850s and began teaching ancient Roman law. But the Napoleon III's regime liberalized and opened up and lightened up on censorship just as the American conflict was beginning in 1860. And with the crisis in America, Laboulaye decided to turn back to his first love, America. And the lecture halls were just crowded with people. Students were pouring in, workers, reformers, foreign visitors, diplomats like Bigelow were coming to hear his lectures. And it became a way of talking about America, became a way of talking about France's political future, about the imperiled Republican experiment in America, the Great Republic. And what did that mean for France? Laboulaye had issued a review of some other books by Agénor Gasparine, who wrote a book just before the war came out called The Uprising of a Great People. It was about the victory, the Republican victory that was going to lead finally to a successful confrontation with the slave power in the United States. It was quickly translated, and it really gave Americans a lot of courage. But he also, Gasparine was telling the French and Europeans, this is our war too. We have a lot at stake. If the United States fails, then the Republican experiment will be dead for sure. Laboulaye wrote a very favorable review, and he used the occasion to remind readers of the Journal de Débat that France had been America's oldest friend, that it had attended its birth in 1778. And also that this war, whatever Lincoln said, whatever the Confederacy said, this war was about slavery. That's what caused the secession crisis. That's what it was about, whatever the Americans told the world. And furthermore, that he added that Napoleon I, now he's playing to the more conservative element in France, wanted the United States to thrive. That's why we gave or sold to America the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, to make sure that they would be strong and be a rival to our enemy, the British. Bigelow recognized immediately a friend, came over to his house, was just fascinated with Laboulaye. He describes coming into his study and seeing all these books, the pictures of Washington and Lafayette and all these American books surrounding his office. And he recognized in Laboulaye a fellow author and scholar and intellectual. And Laboulaye refused any money. He said, I'm doing this, I'm glad to be of service to the Friends of Liberty in America. And he quickly came back with an expanded version of this review essay. Bigelow published it. He sent it to all the members of the Institute of France, all the members of the Corps Legislatif, all the leading government officials in all of Europe, and all the journalists too in France and across Europe. Laboulaye's review of Gasparine's book and his essay on the Franco-American relationship had a powerful effect. And suddenly, Bigelow said a question that seemed to have been closed, that people had just accepted, that, well, once it's broken, you can't put back a republic through war. You can't suppress a dissident minority. That question, the American question, had been reopened. France must be the ally of liberty, Laboulaye told his readers. Now, Laboulaye absolutely loved America, all the more so because he had never been there and never would go there, sadly. It was an ideal for him, but he saw in America and in this Republican example, a distant example of how government by the people could work. This wasn't a fragile, tenuous experiment. This was working. Since 1789, they had one constitution that, even with really serious differences in parties between the Jeffersonians and the Federalists in 1800, the Jacksonians, and on up, government had been passed from one president to another and one party to another, without revolutions, without barricades, without changes in government, until 1860. I'm sure his students reminded him. Meanwhile, France had been through convulsions, one after another, several changes of government, and all kinds of violent revolution. He used to dress in a kind of black or gray kind of tunic with a little white collar. Bigelow thought he looked like a clergyman, but he thought this was the way Republicans should dress, in a very simple way. He wrote a book in 1863 called Paris in America, in French, quickly translated into English and into several other languages. And it was a huge popular success. I believe, though I have not been able to prove, that Bigelow helped get that published overseas. But it's about a Parisian who goes to sleep and has this extended dream in which he wakes up in New England and is astonished to learn that there the government actually supports liberty and defends the citizens' liberty instead of repressing it. That they actually support and defend religious tolerance and diversity. It was a huge success. People were reading it in workshops, they would read to one another, and he had become a kind of star. In 1864, when Lincoln was standing for re-election, and when late in the war, when a lot of people, I think, especially military historians, tend to think that, well, the war was over with Gettysburg and Vicksburg. No, it wasn't. The stock, I mentioned that, Air-General alone, the Confederate bonds, prices were going up all through 1864 and long after Gettysburg, because they thought that sooner or later the South would win just by outlasting the Union. You don't have to win a separatist war. You just have to outlast them. You have to not lose. And so the stock was going up right up until 1864. Laboulaye wrote to the Americans, kind of a voice from abroad. And these voices of Europe telling Americans, here's what we think your war is about. Here's what is at stake. I used this for the epigram that opens the book. The world is a solidarity, and the cause of America is the cause of liberty. So long as there shall be across the Atlantic a society of 30 millions of men living happily and peacefully under a government of their choice, with laws made by themselves. Liberty will cast her rays over Europe like an illuminating pharaoh. American, disencumbered of slavery, will be the country of all ardent spirits, of all generous hearts. But should liberty become eclipsed in the New World, it would become night in Europe. And we shall see the work of Washington, of the Franklins, of the Hamiltons spit upon and trampled underfoot by the whole school which believes only in violence and in success. Now keep that image of liberty with her rays going across the Atlantic to Europe in mind for later. In 1865, just after the election, Bigelow was suddenly promoted to U.S. minister, what we would call ambassador now, but it's U.S. minister to France. William Dayton was found dead in early December in the apartment of a woman of rather questionable reputation and questionable loyalties by all accounts. One Lizzie St. John Eckel, a mysterious woman that Bigelow later described to William Seward as a rather pretty adventurous and enterprising widow, he said. She had come over, she was Canadian, French-Canadian, had come over after a stay in New York. She had married a man who was from the South, I think from Tennessee. He died, I don't know exactly the story there. She had some money but needed some more, and she found an 80-year-old French count and was engaged to him. But in the meantime, was selling favors by, in one case, influencing Dayton with money to introduce a rich American into the French Legion of Honor. And Dayton had come up to her apartment and was found dead on the floor later. There was a great deal of scandal about this, and you can just imagine the way the Paris gossips got a hold of this. So you have a dead ambassador in the apartment. It was a third-floor apartment. He had a stroke. What other activities were involved in addition to climbing the stairs? We can only speculate. But Bigelow explained in a highly confidential letter that he instructed William Seward to burn immediately after reading. Seward said he did burn it after reading it to the president. And but Bigelow was a very resourceful man. He kept everything. So I went to the New York Public Library, got into his letters, and there it was, bound with instructions up on the top. Do not, if you read this letter, destroy it immediately. Wow. But it explains in the most delicate language that testimony from the doctor who came on the scene later, that it appeared under the circumstances that due to the nature of Mr. Dayton's state of dress, that his stroke had been occasioned by activities that neither party wanted to witness. So what do? You've got a dead diplomat on the floor of an apartment of a woman, not his wife, and a woman who is also of, as I say, kind of questionable loyalty. She had been rumored to be playing both sides with the Confederacy. You're supposed to report it to the police, of course, immediately. But late at night, you can imagine this, the doctor, Dayton's son, and a couple of others are that bring the body down, put it in a carriage, take him back to his office, and put him down on the floor there, and report the story that he'd had too much pumpkin pie after working late at the office. Dayton was famous for a lot of things, but not working late at the office. Bigelow now becomes the U.S. minister in April. And on April 26th, following news of the Robert E. Lee's surrender, came the news of Lincoln's assassination. And Bigelow was coming back by train and got off at the station and walked through the streets of Paris. And he said there were just people milling about the streets, just talking and trying to share news and understand what happened. It was the next night that Laboulaye, who was terribly sick in bed, pulled himself out of bed to give a lecture that was supposed to be on Benjamin Franklin, but it of course became also a tribute to Abraham Lincoln. And the hall was absolutely packed with students. They applauded numerous times. Laboulaye wrote, I can understand this as a professor, he wrote to Bigelow and said, never in my life have I had a lecture that's been so well received by students. And he said they were applauding, not for me, but for Lincoln and for America. The students poured out of the lecture hall. They gathered in Place Saint-Michel, and they were preparing to march en masse out the Champs-Élysées to Bigelow's house that was near the Arc of Triumph. And the police came out of the new prefecture with swords drawn, broke up the demonstration, arrested several of the students, and others escaped and fled through the streets, running 3 miles out to Bigelow's house. And there, a cordon of police were barricading the door. And the students, I think emboldened by their own defiance, broke through the barricade and entered into Bigelow's house. Bigelow didn't quite know what to make of it, but they, one of them pulls out of his pocket a prepared statement expressing their solidarity with America, their sympathy for Lincoln and for his family. And Bigelow responds in his very best French how he will be sure that this letter is transmitted to the new president, and that he was very happy for their sign of support. And they shout, "Vive Lincoln, vive la Grande Republique," and then they leave. A whole stream of other politicians begin coming to the house that night in defiance of this censorious government restriction on any kind of public demonstration. And Bigelow writes to Seward that night, I had no idea the hold that Lincoln had on the young people of France. And that the lesson here, it seems to be, he wrote to Thurlow Weed a little later, is that democracy, republicanism, instead of being weaker, seems to be actually stronger than monarchy. That what has impressed people is not the assassination, but the fact that a new president would be appointed, that would take his place, and that the crime had absolutely no effect upon the war or upon the government. For the next several weeks, people began meeting. Meeting in Masonic lodges often, in cafes, signing letters. The letters were sent to Bigelow. Hundreds of them began coming in. Newspapers giving testimony to Lincoln, to America, scolding Napoleon III for not supporting America. Mildly, mind you, because it's still, there's some risk of that. Bigelow collected the letters and then suggested collecting all of these letters because he learned that they were coming in to other countries. About 1,000 of them were collected by the State Department. And the next year were published as part of the diplomatic correspondence and translated, and then put into a large leather-bound copy and given to all of the governments of the world and all of the organizations and individuals that had sent letters. It was a masterful work of public diplomacy, showing these governments, here's what your people think of this Republican experiment. Here's what they think of your policies during the Civil War. One of the campaigns that took place in France began in Nantes, and it was to raise money for a medal for Mrs. Lincoln. It was required that it was a popular subscription, and it came to be known as the 2 sous subscription, because they were to give 10 centimes, and in the old money it was 2 sous. The police cracked down on this. They confiscated the money and they took the subscription list, trying to intimidate this expression of Republican support. Bigelow stepped in and saw that the press got a hold of this, and it became a kind of cause célèbre. And now Victor Hugo, Edouard Laboulaye, all the other opposition political leaders formed what they called the Committee of the French Democracy. And they pushed this subscription all across France. 40,000 people signed, 40,000 people gave their subscription. They had to have the medal minted in Switzerland because Napoleon III's government suppressed it. It now resides at the Library of Congress, and I held this in my hand. It's in a little faded velvet box. And it was in that box that Edouard Laboulaye presented it to John Bigelow and told him, "Tell Mrs. Lincoln that the heart of France is in that little box." The words on the medal were interesting. It says, Lincoln, an honest man. It's a beautiful picture of a tomb with two African Americans on one side and a weeping angel on the other. And on the tombstone it says, Lincoln, an honest man, in French, abolished slavery, reestablished the Union, saved the Republic without veiling the Statue of Liberty. Now that term, I learned, was a familiar expression during the French Revolution, during the Terror. To veil the Statue of Liberty was what it meant. During this time in late April, May, into June, newspapers were talking about raising some kind of monument, something more than just this medal, something that would be more permanent. They suggested New York City. It might be a monument to Lincoln, or to America, and to the Franco-American friendship, or to liberty. Edouard Laboulaye had a group out to dinner at his country estate, and among them was a young artist from Alsace, Auguste Bartholdi. Now you may have heard of him, now you may get the connection. And they were discussing this idea of a monument. And Laboulaye had this idea that it should be something that represents this friendship, not just a victory in a war, or not just a man, but this ongoing friendship. Because between France and America, you had something different than between, say, Italy and France, or God knows, Britain and France. Not just based on national interests, but on shared fundamental principles, ideals. Liberty, equality, fraternity. That's where the idea was born, at least Auguste Bartholdi remembered. Of course, he was about to lose his country in 1870, 1871 with the Franco-Prussian War. And it's at that time that he goes to New York and that he develops this idea of a Statue of Liberty. And it would be a symbol of liberty with her crown, not the Phrygian cap that usually is worn by liberty, but a crown with the radiating spikes that come out, radiating to each of the 7 continents. Remember Laboulaye's expression about the radiating beams coming across from America. And raising not a torch, not like the revolutionary torch, but a flambeau that would illuminate, enlighten the world. This was liberty enlightening the world, what we know as the Statue of Liberty. Of course, later it would take 20 years for this to be realized. In 1887, it was finally raised. Meanwhile, you could see liberty being built out in the workshops in Paris. The last picture in my book shows liberty looming over the city of Paris in 1883, surrounded by scaffolding. This one writer, Adam Gopnik, described as America's greatest Civil War monument. And it is in a way. But I think if it's to be understood fully, it is a monument not to the American Civil War, but to this global conflict that took place in the 1860s. That was the cause not just of the Union, not just of sovereignty for one nation, one place, but the cause of all nations. This universal ideal of liberty enlightening the world. please. The whole day in the Musée d'Orsay researching the evolution of this idea. You're right, there was a model for that, and it was I must say, a much less elegant image of a colossal statue with a flambeau. Yes, that idea was not actually realized, but it was designed by Bartholdi. Yeah.
And he modified the design to make it, or is it totally different?
There are some rough similarities you can see. Yeah, a woman draped with the classical figure with a hand and a torch lighting the way. This is what intrigued me. This is what pulled me into the story originally. I was a Fulbright professor in Italy, and I heard this story that Giuseppe Garibaldi, the great hero of the Italian Risorgimento, was invited not just to raise his sword for the Union, but by Garibaldi's lights to command the entire Union army. Well, it's partly true, and this was another public diplomacy ploy. And so, in July of 1861, William Seward instructs Henry Sanford, another one of these very skillful public diplomatists based in Brussels, but also like Bigelow, a secret, part of the Secret Service, as they called it, special agent as well. And he went down to this little island, Caprera, where Garibaldi lived, and asked him if he would come and serve in the Union Army. Garibaldi said, "I have only two conditions. One is I want command of the entire Union Army. As a lieutenant, I would be useless. A pilot must control his ship. And second, I want the power to declare this war for the abolition of slavery. If it's not for the emancipation of the slaves," and what he said was universal emancipation, "then it would be just a civil war in which the world would have no interest." And so that confounding question, what are you fighting for, is what I opened with. Garibaldi's question is, the Union has to answer that. And they didn't for a while, but they listened as well as told the world. They listened and developed this kind of soft power response to it. It sounds insincere, but they were learning from Garibaldi and from others. Yes,
right.
That's the great crisis of intervention in the fall of 1862.
Right.
And Britain is ready to come in. They would offer mediation. Do you want us to settle a peace? They knew the North would say no, the South would say yes, and that gave them the excuse to say, okay, we're going to recognize the South, end this war, open up the cotton trade, and stop this bloodshed. It was partly a humanitarian excuse and partly, commercial. Well, the hero of that hour, at least from the Union's point of view, was not so much Charles Francis Adams as it was Garibaldi. Again, Garibaldi marches on Rome. He's wounded at Aspromonte, put in jail, and all of Europe is shaken with the rumors that Garibaldi is going to be executed. And not just across Catholic Europe and Italy. There are big demonstrations. But in London, massive public demonstrations. In England, they were free to meet. And in Hyde Park, they estimated 100,000 people came out. And there were big melees between Irish pro-Pope, he was marching on Rome to unseat the Pope, and Garibaldini, Italians, but also sympathizers, Republicans, old Chartists, reformers, Democrats and Republicans, who used the Garibaldi incident to show the power of the people. And it's not the only reason, but it was a major reason that I think Palmerston, remember, who said public opinion is more important than armies, who thought, I'm not going to go into this. This is not going to be a popular war, a third war with the United States of America.
Right.
So they backed away. Mm-hmm. But the other reason was that it caused a crisis in the French government, and Napoleon had to change foreign ministers. Trouvenel was out, and Drouin de Lhuys was brought in, and he was much more, he had a different policy on Rome. Anyway, that is complicated
Thank you.
diplomacy and public diplomacy. But yeah, they came very close at that time. And you had your hand up. Yes. Well, it was complicated insofar as Lincoln in his inaugural address said, "I have no power and no intention to interfere with slavery where it exists." And Europeans thought, what the hell, the anti-slavery party has just won the election, and now you're saying you're not going to abolish slavery? But Lincoln was a lawyer, he was a man of law, and he was just stating the truth. He was also trying to show the world that this is a rebellion without cause. They have no reason to rebel. They are saying that this is abolitionist, but it is not. The Republican idea was that Lincoln understood that the states had the right to protect slavery where it existed, but the Republican idea was to strangle it, to stop it from expanding, and to make the states come to terms with a non-expansive, dying, soil-exhausting economy.